And you're rolling.
For the midterm?
Well, hello, my name is Natalie, and we are going over head and neck, week 1. We unfortunately didn't get to lecture. We don't really know who our teacher is going to be, or what he or she is going to present to us. But anyway, I'm going to go over lab stuff, which we covered a good bit with Dr. Kim, is who I have for lab. And he likes to add a lot of extra things, so it's probably good to keep up with that. Alright, first off, big thing to know are the functional components. What are the functional components? Well, we have GSA, which is general somatic afferent, GSE, general somatic efferent, GVA, GVE, which the A and E still for afferent and efferent, we know that, and then visceral. And it breaks down further into the special ones, which is SVA, SSA. Alright, so to go over these. GSA. That's covering, first of all, just know that there's 3 cell bodies. I'm not going to go through how to draw it out to know where the 3 cell bodies are located, but keep in mind that there's 3 cell bodies involved in the GSA functional component. Those involve the extra receptive sensations from the skin, i.e. pain, temperature, touch, and proprioception, because it's sensory, so it kind of makes sense. GSE, efferent, so it deals with skeletal muscle, the output, what the skeletal muscle is doing. GVA, which is dealing with visceral now, this is dealing with pain or subconscious visceral reflexes, or in sensations from the organs. So if you get pain in the stomach, or blood pressure levels, or it could be like blood gas levels, whatever it is. And then GVE, within the visceral still, efferent, it transmits information to the smooth muscle. So with the one I just talked about with the GSA is with skeletal muscle, GVE, smooth muscle. And glands is another thing to remember. Alright, so with the SVA, the way to remember it, he said think about eating. So you think about your senses. So when you're eating, you're going to want to taste it, and you may or may not want to smell it, but that's the other thing to remember with SSA, or SVA, is think about eating, smell and taste. SSA, hearing and sight is what's associated with that. Now the big guy that he keeps talking about is SVE, which is the last functional component, and that's dealing with the pharyngeal arches and the cranial nerves 5, 7, 9, 10, and 11. So if we want to go through those, 5, trigeminal nerve, and that's dealing with the mastication muscles. 7 is the facial, so that's all related to facial expression muscles. The 7-9 is glossopharyngeal, which is dealing mainly with pharyngeal muscles. You can look in the lab manual, I'll reference those later so you know where to go for that. The vagus nerve, whatever happens in vagus, it's all parasympathetic. But the ones we're talking about right now is dealing with the laryngeal and 1 pharyngeal muscle. And the spinal accessory is associated with the SCM and the trapezius muscle. Alright, so there's deep fascia that we need to know about in this class, and if you want to reference in the lab manual, page 271, you can look at that and make more sense of it when you want to go over that. So the first one is the investing fascia. The investing fascia surrounds the sternocleidomastoid and the trapezius muscle. The pretracheal fascia, as in the name, trachea, so it's going to surround the anterior portion of the neck, surrounding the trachea, the esophagus, and the thyroid gland. So it makes sense. Prevertebral fascia, once again, in the name, it's going to cover the prevertebral muscles, and it's continuous with the deep fascia on the floor of the posterior triangle, which you can also look in the book and see those pictures. The last one is the carotid sheath, which he actually drew out a picture for us. For that one, in the notes, I have a picture on there so you guys can have a copy of this as well. And the carotid sheath covers 4 main things. That's the common carotid artery, internal jugular vein, the ansa cervicalis, and the vagus nerve. Those are what run through the area the carotid sheath surrounds right there. And another thing he just added on the side, Dr. Kim loves to add you with extra information, that involves the carotid sinus, carotid sheath, carotid sinus, and we know that's a baroreceptor. And he also added in the little information that if you press too hard in that area, you can cause a person to pass out, which is because of the blood pressure being too low. Therefore, their heart rate also decreases and the person can pass out. So just an extra FYI right there. So moving on, we looked at the posterior triangle in the lab this week. And just so you know, the posterior triangle also, it divides into 2 smaller triangles, which you can reference again in the lab manual, page 274. And it divides into 2 triangles via the omohyoid muscle. So the first one is actually called the occipital triangle, and it's called that because at the apex of the triangle, there is actually the occipital nerve up there. So it's kind of like a way to associate that. And the supraclavicular triangle is the bottom half, and as in the name, it sits right above the clavicle. So that's easy to remember. And then if you want to go over the muscles of the posterior neck, or the posterior triangle of the neck, go ahead and look on page 269 in the lab manual, and you can look at the insertions and the innervations there. So what I did is I actually drew out the cervical plexus on here if you want to look at this. That is also in the lab manual, page 270. For me, I find it easier to draw things out, so it'll make more sense if you have any lab instructor that wants to ask you which innervation or what nerve innervates what area of the body and everything, so that's a good way to look at that. Some key points within the cervical plexus is to remember that the lesser occipital nerve, the greater auricular, and the transverse cervical all come together to form an area called Erb's point. So that's not actually indicated in the book, but that's something the doctor came added in there. So it's called Erb's point, E-R-B-S. And that happens as what I'm looking at. It looks like it's going to be in the C2. It's a C2, C3 area, kind of. All right, another thing to look into what he gave us information about was C1, C2, C3. He wanted to know the ventral root and the dorsal root. With C1, there's only a dorsal root to know about, and that's a suboccipital nerve. I believe it, yeah, suboccipital, that's affiliated with that. C2, the ventral root, would be the lesser occipital. The dorsal root is the greater occipital. And then with C3, we have the least occipital. I don't really know where to reference that from. That's just what I got from lab. So if you want to go over that, you might want to look in the COA book for that. And then other information, if you want to look on page 275 of the lab manual, there's actually a drawing of the posterior triangle. I drew one out on here, so that's on the notes. And it just shows you all of the nerves and the muscles that are affiliated with that area, so that'd be good to reference to. Also, we started dissecting into the anterior portion of the neck, where you have the hyoid bone, the tracheus there, you have the thyroid gland, and then the sternum, which that goes down into. And there's muscles that are affiliated with that. So you might want to look into that portion of the lab manual. I didn't reference that one down, but I'll mention the muscles to you. So we covered the stylohyoid, and think about every single one I'm naming here, just think about what's in the word. Think Dr. Biz, what's in the word, where is it going, what's it attached to, where does it insert? Stylohyoid muscle, going to the styloid, and obviously connected to the hyoid. And that's affiliated with cranial nerve 7, just so you know, that's all in the lab manual. We have the mylohyoid, which is cranial nerve 5, the digastric muscle, and you might also want to look into, when you go into the lab, make sure you can distinguish the difference between the anterior belly of the digastric muscle versus the posterior belly of the digastric muscle, which you may or may not see. Nonetheless, we also have the hyoid bone, and between the hyoid bone and the thyroid bone is the thyrohyoid muscle. Between the thyroid bone and the sternum is the sternothyroid, which makes sense, all in the word. And then between the hyoid and the sternum is the sternohyoid muscle. And also don't forget about there's a thyroid cartilage and then the cricothyroid cartilage, which actually falls posterior to the thyroid cartilage. And it's a very small area, and that's actually innervated by the external laryngeal nerve. We also saw the omohyoid muscle, and all of those lower muscles that I talked about that I didn't say what it was innervated by, those are all innervated by the ansa cervicalis, which is from C2, C3. And then the last bit of muscles that we probably have seen in the lab, you can reference in the lab manual, page 281. And those are the muscles of the anterior triangle of the neck. And just so you know, I just took extra notes out of the book. It divides into four smaller triangles, which goes into the carotid, the muscular, the submental, and the submandibular. And you can find further information in the book for that. Let's see if I can find some extra information here. We didn't really look at the scalene muscles, but what I took note of in my notebook here is between the anterior scalene between the anterior scalene, there's the brachial plexus and the subclavian artery, and that's all part of the prevertebral fascia. Between the middle and posterior scalene, there's two nerve fibers that run along there, and that's the long thoracic and dorsal scapular nerve. So those are just extra FYIs. So I would really suggest going into the lab manual. It's easier to go on the lab manual because the COA is just huge and full of a lot of extra information. But go into the lab manual, look at the charts, make sense of it. It's really pretty easy once you put the words together with where they're going. But draw the drawings if that's easier for you to learn. Where are the like at which portion of the cervical level are they coming out of, because that's really what we're going to be needing to know for lecture, which we haven't covered yet, but in lecture we're going to be needing to know the muscles and their innervations and such. So I guess that covers everything. Thanks.